Welcome back to the Village Bonfire for another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. A podcast not just for your mind, but for your body and spirit too. Here we don't just talk theory. Instead, we compassionately engage with our lived experiences and a wide variety of topics together, all to invite the question, in these times we find ourselves in, how do we be more human? Thank you for being here. May these conversations awaken, inspire, repair, and evolve something deep within each of us and serve the wild, tender aliveness of our personal and collective hearts. Hi everyone, Kate here. So a quick note before we dive into the full episode. You probably saw from the title that this conversation is going to be around sacredness. And I suspect with the help of sort of the opening of the eclipse portal, in the relatively short period of time between when I originally recorded this episode and now right before it airs, this theme of sacredness has stayed with me and been working with me. And you'll hear me say even at one point in the episode that part of this human journey is constantly realizing, new layers and new little places where we're not living in alignment with the things we say we're standing for. And so there have been new layers of that coming up. And parts of this episode that were recorded here, it's not going to be serving them to share them in this wide, undiscerning format, right? Like this podcast, my intention for this podcast is to reach as many people as want to listen to it, right? And I think in this globalized digital world, we're sort of in a place of having to reevaluate what is authenticity, what is relationship, what is connection, because those can be real online. And there are also certain aspects of holding things as sacred that need our discernment, need our boundaries, need a certain level of, need some thresholds of relationship, of mutual care, of trust and intimacy to be met before they can actually be held and shared properly and in full honoring of their sacredness. And so, so I'm constantly being schooled by that, as I think many of us are. And I'm aware that this could probably be a full podcast episode in and of itself. But I've decided, as relates to this episode, I've decided not to scrap the whole episode, but you will be hearing me interject at a couple points throughout where I feel like I'm dancing close to either story that isn't mine to share or details that, I actually don't think this wider medium is appropriate for. And so this is a first on this podcast. I try to not edit these conversations because I want them to be real, but this isn't so much an editing as it is that refining and that discerning. And I want to be clear too, this is not about vulnerability hangover or anything like that. It really is about being in integrity for me. And so thanks for being on this experiment with me. And now to the episode. Hey. So welcome back to another episode of Wild Sacred Journey podcast. And sometimes I remember to introduce myself and often I do not. But anyway, I'm your host, Kate Powell, ceremonialist, medicine woman, story weaver, and soul revival guide. And also just kind of human. Multi-passionate human. And so, these conversations, whether they're just kind of my musings, as this episode will be, or a conversation with another human, are, really what we're gathering around the fire to kind of explore is what does it mean to be human in these days, in these times, and to explore perhaps sort of ancestral processes or ancestrally inspired processes for being initiated into being human, for becoming wise. And if you listen to my conversation with Tad Hargrave from Marketing for Hippies, I asked him at one point, what do you consider being human to mean? And, and he was talking about how he feels that in all of his learning, studyings, whatever we want to call it, that being human is not a given, that many of our ancestors understood that being human is not a given and that it's something that we become initiated into. And, I've been sitting with that a little bit because I'd never heard anybody sort of phrase it quite that way before. And yet I feel the truth of it sort of somewhere deep within me, or a resonance of truth within it. And so I've been kind of thinking, what does that mean for me with the kind of work that I do, with the sort of medicine that I am coming to understand I carry. And so before I so this episode, I'm recording this episode. It'll be released on a full moon that is also a lunar eclipse. So that'll be March 25th, 2024. And, full moons are times for harvesting more. So new moons are really more times to sort of set our intentions. Full moons are times for kind of reaping the harvest, starting to release, preparing for that kind of downward cycle, the waning time before the cycle begins again. And then to have the sun's shadow move across the moon, the earth's shadow move across the moon. During this eclipse, there's something there then perhaps about what the shadow might reveal to us about the seeds that we planted on the new moon, or what the shadow might reveal to us about something we haven't yet seen. And so, there's even more kind of closures and endings that are present. And some of the astrologers I sort of follow up in saying, because this moon will be in Libra, that actually the eclipse that happened, this closes kind of the portal, the chapter that happened back in October, mid-October of last year of 2023. So any themes that we've been kind of tracking that sort of got awoken in mid-October are now kind of coming to some sort of completion, closing, releasing. There will be some sort of shift around that at this time. So before we kind of go deeper into all of that, and I should say, so because of that, I'm feeling called to sort of speak to sacredness actually today. And so before we dive into that, we'll light the fire. Didn't take right away, so that's an interesting thing to note. And there's something even that sort of feels a little dissonant actually in lighting the fire this time, because sort of so much of what I think I'll be speaking to is sort of the stuff that happens at the edge of where the light and darkness meet, like right at that threshold, that sort of shadowy, flickering, numinous threshold. And so just naming that, so that as we kind of take our deep breaths, as we sort of bring our awareness and our attention just to kind of our attention, I'm not sure if I said attention or tension there. I meant attention, our awareness and attention, as we kind of just gently draw that in, so that we allow ourselves to become present, allow ourselves to just become receptive, allow ourselves to just be here now, give ourselves that gift. As we do that, perhaps this time we do notice and we honor that there's something that feels a little bit different about this fire, that it's maybe not about looking right at the glow, at the illumination, but sort of looking at the shadows. One of the things I've become aware of is there's sort of different, part of my role, my medicine, my gift, whatever we want to call it, my practice, my regular practice and devotion, is to sort of this like being able to move between realms, right? And one of the things I've been noticing recently is sort of this idea of the difference between looking directly at a flame, right? Like looking directly at the light versus looking at the shadows cast on the walls, which are actually kind of more in that realm of illusion, right? We're thinking about it in terms of our thoughts. There's like, or our consciousness, right? There's like the part of our consciousness we shine direct light on. And then there's the shadows dancing on the walls, right? Which may or may not have anything to do with reality, right? They can be massive, massive distortions of what's actually happening, right? It's like taking something that's happening in the light of the fire and then creating something that might resemble it or might resemble something else entirely. But then there's this space right between sort of where the light starts to edge into darkness. And there's something there that isn't illusion and distortion and isn't direct gaze. And I'm coming to sort of sense that as being a place of intuition, a place where the numinous, where the sacred can start to speak to us. And so as I was kind of sitting in something more like that space the other night, this message came through that said, sacredness is not what we do or even what we feel. It's a quality of presence and listening, which allows for some magic, some alchemy, and potential for some sort of connection or relationship to occur. So I'll say that again. And I'll honor to it that this is still a download, if we want to call it that, or an awareness that I'm still deeply sitting with. It's one that I think I've probably always on some level been aware of, and yet am becoming more conscious of. It's coming from that shadowy edge a little bit closer to the light. So sacredness is not what we do or even what we feel. It's a quality of presence and listening. And it allows for magic, for alchemy, and for the potential for relationship or connection of some kind to occur. And so one of the first things that kind of came to mind as that came through was a couple years ago, I was out on a hike. Kate here with one of those quick interruptions. So at this point in the original recorded episode, I began sharing about a hike I went on one time to a sacred site. And while I didn't go into too much detail, I did go into more detail than I actually feel okay with sharing. As I've been listening into it since then, and it feels like it was dancing sort of dangerously close to things that were not actually my story to share. So I am just sharing a story about going on a sacred hike. And part of the reason I started sharing with more of that detail was that I wanted to share with you some of my process for just engaging with the sacredness. And so what I will share is that, at the beginning, before I set off, I made offerings. I connected with the ancestors and spirits of the land and the place where I was, and I asked permission and waited until I felt like I got it, and that it's really important to also ask permission from the space of being willing to honor when you don't get it and when it's a no, because I've also been on hikes where I asked permission and I received a no, or a yes initially, and then partway through the hike, I felt that shift to a no. And so then I turned back. So the process here is important. The location is actually not mine to share. Now back to the original recording. Right, one of our deepest colonial mindsets and how we've internalized colonialism is this assumption that because the land is there, we are entitled to walk it. And if we start to shift into this space of recognizing everything as sacred, then we start to recognize that this is that animistic belief that land has a certain consciousness, that there are ancestors connected with that land, that there's a whole web of kinship. And if we want to be in sacred reciprocity, in right relationship with that kinship, we have to unlearn that colonialist idea that just because something's there, we are entitled to be there as well. So I'd asked for permission. I felt like I received permission. And actually, I had a profoundly beautiful experience all along the walk of actually feeling, seeing, sensing we'll just say the spirits and ancestors of the land where I was lining the trail. It was really beautiful to see and feel and sense them. It was an incredible gift. And, you know, in each step I took, I kept making sure, like, you know, is this all right? May I continue? You know, kept feeling like I had this yes. So I continue along the trail and I end up at this site as I was sitting there, just kind of meditating and just being in that space and offering it my presence, right? I mean, the greatest gift we can give something sacred is our presence. So as I'm sitting there, just being present with it and listening and witnessing, right? Witnessing is not just observing in a detached way. Witnessing is being present ourselves so that our whole self is there, so that we're offering who and what we are exactly as we are to the other, whatever the other is, right? And by doing that, then we're witnessing them as they are, whether it's a human, whether it's a non-human. And then that's where that relationship can occur, right? Is in that space where I am fully present, no masks, no pretense, no doing. And I open myself up in that way as an invitation for something else to approach and to share itself with me. And as we do that, an exchange happens. Both are probably changed by the experience. So as I'm sitting there in that space, there's a young woman tromping all over, dressed in a way that I'm not going to lie, my mind went to some judgments. Kind of a very new agey, hippie, sort of performative, also sort of culturally appropriative kind of outfit. And I don't know her. I don't know her background. You know, I don't know. I don't know. But I did notice that there was some judgment that sort of got triggered there, which is partly mine to look at. And also anytime judgment comes up, that's one of my teachers, you know, a super helpful thing one of my teachers once reminded me of is anytime I'm judging something in someone else, I'm actually discerning what is or isn't for me. So it may have been that there was something in her energy and in her way of being that I was discerning was dissonant, energetically dissonant from how I want to be in the world and with the world, right? So anyway, so she's tromping around and she stops and she kind of looks at me and she goes, man, can't you just feel how sacred this place is? As she's climbing all over the caves, stomping all through like the stones that are there, taking selfies, right? And it was one of those moments that was like so heartbreaking and so funny all at the same time, because it was like the full encapsulation of our humanness, of just being so self-centered and clueless, and also so tuned in and beautiful at the same time, right? And it just really highlighted for me how much even there's so many people who don't even recognize the sacred anymore, right? Because we have so few, we don't highlight it, we don't honor it, we don't prize it in many ways. Our understanding of what sacred even is has sort of gotten distorted by a lot of systems of power in the form of many organized religions. So not only do so many people not even recognize what's sacred anymore, but then even the ones that don't actually know how to be in the presence of it, to be in relationship with it, to be changed by it in some way, right? And so, sacredness. So the distinction, I've been feeling a lot too recently into the distinction between ritual and ceremony. And ritual being actions that we repeat that help support a certain habits, certain ways of being, certain mindsets, certain devotional aspects, right? And a ceremony is something much deeper. A ceremony is and part of what I've been thinking about ceremony with is through conversations that have been happening between Stephen Jenkinson and Kimberly Ann Johnson and their Forgotten Pillars offering. So, but ceremony is a way of supporting ourselves through a portal, through an initiation, through a threshold, right? Recognizing that for some reason this is an alchemical moment in our lives where something's going in one side and coming out the other side transformed in some deep way. And because ceremony exists with the sacred, because true ceremony cannot happen without some sense of whether you want to call it God, spirit, the universe, divine mystery, just mystery, numinous, whatever you want to call it, that has to be present for it to actually be. That's like that's the missing alchemical ingredient, that if we don't bring that in, then our ceremonies are not complete. They're not full. They're not whole. So that's when we end up starting to feel like our initiations are incomplete, or that's where we start to name things as being traumatic rather than being initiatory. So if we are truly in ceremony and we've invited this great mystery in to co-create with us, or we've surrendered some part of the mystery, just like a caterpillar going into that cocoon and turning into total goo and then coming out the other side a butterfly, right? So that's what ceremony is it's that gooification process that, well, really it begins before the gooification process. It begins as we move, and perhaps this is some of what that idea that humans are initiated into being humans, right? Like a caterpillar doesn't decide to go into the cocoon and become a butterfly. That's in its DNA. And so if we come back to a place where our DNA moves us on a trajectory of initiation into being human, then ceremony will happen. And if ceremony happens, we let go of the outcome. The caterpillar does not know it's going to be a butterfly on the other side. It may not even know it's going to become goo. It just does what it does, right? And so, I think that's part of being in relationship with the sacred, and it's sort of funny too, because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine not that long ago, and we were sort of talking about how we talk about our work with people. And for a long time, I avoided talking about my work as being, I tried to kind of play down the soulfulness and what I feel to be the sacredness of what happens in the containers that I hold for clients or for groups. And, and I sort of did that with this idea of like, well, I want to make it more accessible for people. Just bring them in and then they can see, they don't have to believe it's happening for it to work on them. Right. And there's an element of truth to that. I certainly have had times in my life where had I known how it was going to turn out, I probably wouldn't have done it. Spiritual awakenings are not particularly fun. They look all flashy and memeable on social media right now, but their rites of passage can be quite rough. So had I known what the outcome was going to be, or not the outcome, had I known what the process was going to be and how I was going to feel along the way, would I have opted in? Maybe not. But I'm so glad I did on the other side, right? So I feel like I took us down a rabbit hole there. Let me get back to my original thread. Um, oh yeah. So speaking about sacred, yes. So there is an element of like, you know, we don't necessarily need to know what we're getting into. And sometimes it's even a little bit better if our brain isn't like totally like that, then I this, and then this, and then this, and then this, because that's actually counter to the process that inhibits the process. But there's also something that feels a little, for me anyway, just felt a little unethical in this idea of not being fully clear about who I am and what people can expect from the container. Um, and you risk getting people in the container who are then resisting it the whole time because that's not what they signed up for, and they're not wrong about that. um, but it also feels like, kind of this like, what am I taking a stance on behalf of? And if you've listened to other episodes, you might have heard me kind of talk about this a little bit before, how there was a moment where I had a deep shift where I realized I'd been doing my work, thinking of my quote unquote healing work as being in support of people's wounds. And then I started realizing, well, that's a really unsustainable like stance to take, because everybody's wounded all the time and I cannot support that. And B, that idea of like what we feed grows, right? And so even if it's on an unconscious level or subconscious level, if my intention is to be in service to somebody's wounds, then that's actually what I'm feeding. And so I had to kind of be like, no, what am I taking a stance on behalf of? Even if that means sometimes standing up for it to my clients, right? Like on their behalf. Sometimes what's coming forward in a session is someone's smaller self, scared self, limited self, wounded self, right? And so sometimes I need to actually stand up to that version of them on behalf of a more tender, more innocent, more soulful version of them. And so it may not feel comfortable to that wounded self, but it's in service to something that is ultimately more regenerative, more precious, um, more aligned with aliveness, with love, with the mystery, with what's sacred and soulful, right? And so ultimately, that is in many ways what I stand for, is the sacred soulfulness. And so I think if we, when we take those moments where we really choose, what is it I'm standing for? What is it I'm standing on behalf of? You know, um, yeah, then it's like, that's what we start to see in our lives. And that's also where we start to see where there's dissonance, disharmony, rupture, right? All of these other things. Here again with another quick interruption just to laugh and say, man, that comment aged like fine wine as I'm going through and updating this recording just to honor this new level of alignment that I'm coming into around sacredness and holding things as sacred and the intimacy of that. So here we are in action. So, so just to say too, it doesn't mean everybody has to believe in the exact same sacred presence that I do, or the same understanding of what a sacred presence is that I do, but that we can agree that there is some sort of sacred consciousness, some sort of sacred presence, that it's not something sacred, isn't something we do, right? We can't just like lay crystals around and be like, oh, now it's sacred, right? Like maybe it's a step closer. Maybe the act of laying the crystals brought us closer to something. Maybe we can feel something as sacred, right? Oh my gosh, look at the sun shining on that blossom. Look at that newborn baby. Look at that adorable puppy, right? feel the breeze on our skin, hear the bird song, right? Like there's all these different ways. Look at a beautiful view. There's wonder, there's awe, there's curiosity, there's that upswelling of emotion, that sense of being connected into something so much larger than our limited human bodies, than our limited human minds, right? So in that moment, we're feeling something closer to sacredness. But I think that question of bringing our presence in, bringing our listening to it, then we become changed by it. We allow ourselves to become sacred ourselves. And once we become sacred ground, then we can meet other things on sacred ground. And I fucking believe that the world would change if we could do this, y'all. Because again, it's not about any one particular sense of whether the sacred is a man or a woman or whatever color or whatever creed or whatever this or whatever that, right? Like sacred is a quality of presence and listening that allows us to be in relationship with ourselves and the world and to be changed by that. I'm just listening in for a moment, actually, because I had this whole other story I was going to kind of tell today, but I'm actually thinking that might be enough for today. I'm not thinking it, I'm hearing it. And so, yeah, I'm going to honor that, not push through that, and let myself be changed by the message. So, what are your thoughts? How does this conversation leave you? What musings or wonderings does this conversation prompt in you? I'm curious. Yeah. So thank you for joining me for this moment around the fire. Be kind to yourself if you have a lot getting stirred up on this full moon lunar eclipse. If you are like, this sounds bogus and I don't believe in that stuff, that's okay too. But I guess I would then invite you to ask yourself, what do you gain by not believing in it? And what do you lose, if anything, by not believing in it or not being open to the possibility of it? I had someone ask me one time, what if you make up all these signs? What if all of that's made up? And it's like, I don't think that's true because the universe takes me to task sometimes and tells me some shit I do not want to hear. And I don't think I'd make that up willingly. um, but also, again, that question of like we are meaning making creatures, us humans. And so why on earth wouldn't we make meaning that changes us and initiates us into being more human? So be well and be human, stay human. And until next time. Hi, Kate here again. Thank you for gathering with us. Whether you've been here a while or found your way here thanks to today's guest, it means so much to me and the world I dream of to have you here. I hope you'll tune in for more of our conversations. We humans seem to be at a profound threshold and facing questions of deep impact for the future and the world. We need our full hearts and humanity as we sow seeds of change in these times of joy and heartbreak. I count myself lucky to be here now, around this virtual village fire, weaving our stories into a medicine with humans like you. As a community medicine space, this podcast is relational. It weaves webs of connection and mutual respect and care across time and space. If you appreciate and support the future we're seeding here, you can support the weaving of this web in a few ways. 1. Share episodes with friends and family or online with your community. It also helps the podcast immensely if you like, rate, subscribe to, or follow the podcast where you watch or listen, so you get notified when new episodes drop and new listeners find us as they search. 2. Join us on Patreon. Doing so supports conversations like the one you just heard and allows you access to live community gatherings and medicine circles and more as we continue to grow. It also helps me keep the space advertisement-free so the conversations stay intact as they are. If you have questions, suggestions, connections, or would like to find out more about working with me, you can find me online at www.wildsacredjourney.com, on Instagram at wildsacredjourney_KP, or email me, kate@wildsacredjourney.com. Until next time, from my heart to yours, I release today's fire with a prayer for our individual and collective wholeness, connection, and joy. May it be so.